Hi, Henry.
Hi, Guy.
How you doing? All right?
Very good, very good. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm keen to try your wines. So we're in for a bit of a treat here because obviously very impressive family history, and you are heavily involved with wine yourself, which is why we've got you here today to discuss Harrow and Hope. For those who don't know, can you let us know how you got into wine and you ended up starting your own wine brand and how you're just charging forward with it now?
Yeah, obviously, having parents who've been in the industry for, God, must be like 52 years now. Since I can remember, it was always there. I was dragged around wineries as a baby. Lots of photos of me in my nappies, in great vineyards, etc., etc. So it's always been there in the sort of background. But my sort of memory of when I really sort of thought, wow, this could actually be for me was I left school and I'd done some helps at Harvest down in Bordeaux quite a few times, but I left school and maybe my parents wanted me out of the house, and I just wanted to do something. They sent me to do a harvest in the Ardèche in a little village called Vineyard, which literally means Valley of the Vines. Beautiful part of the world, very isolated. Classic French, 20 years in the past, 50 years in the past. But then right next to it was this huge, great sort of concrete co-op. And Laithwaites were sort of, had placed a fly and winemaker in this co-op to help them control the winemaking process and make wines for them that they sold through Laithwaites. And it was me and another assistant winemaker, some Aussie girl, so a Frenchman, an Aussie, and an Englishman. And it was sort of, I was just sort of the lowest of the low, lugging hoses, cleaning floors, all that sort of stuff. But it was, for me, as I remember, it was a pretty magical sort of month and a half. I sort of really sort of threw myself into French culture, went wild boar hunting on a Thursday and a Saturday, and, loved the people. Obviously, I loved the wine, but I think for me, it was the culture surrounding wine production that I sort of really fell in love with, the people, and that was sort of where I thought, okay, I could really see myself doing this, not just the product and the business side, but just the culture and the people, and just really enjoyed it. But I did think, well, it can't all be this good. This is one small part in France. So the next year I hopped over to Australia, to McLaren Vale, and I was still 18 years old, and did a harvest at a place called Tatachilla in McLaren Vale. It's quite a big winery back then, right in the main town of McLaren Vale. Much different, very different sort of experience. It was much more sort of, I'd say, industrial, much more intense. There were no 2-hour lunch breaks. It was very much, 12-hour shifts, night and day, fruit just coming in all the time, from all different parts of the country. And obviously, the harvest was like 4 months long, because you were all the early stuff and the late stuff coming from all around Australia. So you got to see an amazing amount of different fruit, worked with some great winemakers, Michael Fragos, who's down at Chapel Hill at the moment. And yeah, very different, but I just loved, again, a different side of it, but I just loved it as much, and met some amazing people. It's very international, lots of South Africans, obviously lots of Aussies, and just an 18-year-old English boy. So I did stand out like a sore thumb, but absolutely loved it. And that was it, really. That was sort of those two sort of harvest experience. That's what got me into wine. Came back to the UK, tried to study winemaking in the UK, but just couldn't find it. It didn't exist when I was looking. I think I was probably a year too early. The Plumpton course must have started a couple of years after. So this was sort of 1999. And so I went to study biology instead at Durham University. So it was the only subject really I enjoyed at school. And that's where I met my to-be future wife, Kaye. We studied biology together. Well, she studied it. I stole all her notes, but she got me through it. And then after that, I, essentially just threw myself into trying to get as much experience as I possibly could, because I didn't study enology. I thought, well, the only way I'm going to really get the knowledge I need is just to learn on the job, and to be honest, that's the way I learn best anyway, working with great winemakers.
Sure.
I must have done, I reckon 20 odd harvests, but mainly focused on red wine. So that's all I drank. I was obsessed with, very large, quite highly alcoholic, Aussie Shirazes, Cabernets. But then I come over and often do a harvest in Bordeaux, which I love as well. Quite different, obviously, a different setup. And after a while, I'd started to make a bit of my own wine. So I went out and bought grapes in Australia and also in France. So I had a sort of little setup doing sort of a bit of my own production. And then
where was that?
So I did in McLaren Vale. I helped set up, in conjunction with Laithwaites, they set up this thing called Redhead Studio.
Yeah.
So essentially, it's called a wine studio. It was actually an old curry restaurant called Redheads. That was the name of the curry restaurant. And they essentially bought it, ripped it out, ripped all the tables and chairs out, put little sort of open 1-2 ton open fermenters, which were actually water butts. And, you could just pay a sort of per ton fee to make, you just had to provide your fruit, go out to the growers, buy the fruit, buy the barrels, and then you get to use the equipment, etc., etc. So, I was there to help set that up, and then I used it also to start my own winemaking projects. And then in France, I tried to do a similar thing in Bordeaux, but it's not the place. You can't just go up to Cheval Blanc and say, "Can I buy a ton of grapes?" It doesn't work. So I really had to work very hard to get some growers to persuade them to sell me some fruit, and they looked at me quite baffled. But I managed to find a few. We had some great vineyards, and sort of did a similar sort of setup in France. And then the rest of the year for me was spent going around doing tastings and essentially selling direct to consumer.
And what about
sort of the early part?
Sorry, and so now you have your own English sparkling wine brand. How did that come into existence?
So that was basically because I was doing this for a good 8 years, I think, and there was for me there was a bit missing. It's great to turn up just before harvest, 2 weeks, and you go around the vineyards, and in Australia it's fine. Ripeness is not really an issue in Australia. Over ripeness is probably more of an issue. So you can be pretty on it as far as picking dates. But it's more in Europe. If you had a marginal year in Europe, turn up 2 weeks before harvest, and it's maybe the vineyard's slightly overcropped. There's not much you can do to improve the situation. You can cut a bit of crop off, but telling a grower you're going to cut some of his crop off and then you're going to pay him the same rate, a very difficult conversation.
Yeah.
I felt like I was missing out, certainly in the margin, all those decisions about growing grapes. I was missing out on, and I thought, well, if we're going to work in more marginal climates, you have to control every part of the process. In my head, that was, but if I really want to make the best wine I possibly can, I want to control the grape growing process. And that's when, I managed to buy some vineyards, about 4 hectares off an old guy, Jean-Pierre, who had, he broke his back, and I'd bought grapes off him before, and he just had 3 daughters, not interested in growing grapes, and I bought 4 hectares off him. And then me and my wife Kaye, we moved out to France and spent 2009 working in the vineyards, growing the grapes and making the wine. After that year, I'd had a great time. My wife slightly less so. I think she's bored. She doesn't come from a wine background, and we were sort of late 20s. And I think she just wanted to get back to the UK and sort of with her friends and family. And I knew it probably wasn't going to be the end game for us to be living in France. If you're in wine, it's like the best place ever. But if you're not that into wine, or you're not obsessed about wine, there's not much else going on. So we decided, okay, we're going to come back to the UK. We kept the vineyard, etc., just leased it out. And that's really the point where we turned our attention to England and what could England actually offer. And the more we looked into it, I'd never considered England as a viable fine wine region. From 18 years old, I just never in my head thought I'd end up, in Marlow making sparkling wine. That was just not the plan. I thought I'd be surfing in Western Australia, making Shiraz. That was what I had in my head. But such is life. And yeah, so that was the point where it was like, okay, the more we tried of the, the sort of pioneers, the Night Timbers, the Ridgeviews, and then the sort of, I guess you could call it second wave, the Gusbournes, the Wistons. My mum had planted Vineyard Wyfold back in 2003, and she was starting to do well with her wines. And from a quality point of view, it was quite obvious that there was a viable product that could compete on the sort of global stage. And that was important. I didn't just want to make a wine that was a novelty because it was grown in England. I had to be able to take it to my winemaking friends and say, look at that. That's what England can do. So that was the point, really, I thought.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, because that's where, as an industry, we have to be able to stand on the quality of the product. It can't just be the novelty that's going to be here and gone. And as you say, it's got to be about producing exceptional wines for where we are.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. So, financially, I didn't, we did a business plan and thought, okay, how big would we have to be? What's our yields going to be? How much are we going to be able to sell it for? And these numbers, I've talked to a lot of producers, and the yields were just all over, the stories of yields were all over the place. And we're like, okay, we have no idea what the yield's going to be like. But I know what I think they should be like. This is the sort of yield I think we need to get to be able, from a quality. Well, I didn't know from a quality point of view, because, champagne crops at, can crop at 15, 20 ton a hectare. I knew we weren't going to get that. But, where is the sweet spot for English sparkling wine? That I didn't know. But I knew from a financial point of view, we had to hit, we had to get a certain yield to make the whole business profitable. Because again, if it's not profitable, it's a lot of work to not make any profit. So that was quite, sitting down and doing a proper business plan. I'd never done that before. I just winged it. So it was a good exercise to do. But obviously you're dealing with nature and you have no idea. We hadn't even planted a vine. So a lot of question marks. And then we just went searching for land. We could have gone anywhere in the country. We did look at maybe Dorset, being by the coast. My wife likes the coast. Obviously there were a lot of vineyards in Kent and Sussex. But for me, being, I was born in Reading, I knew the family from the Thames Valley. It baffled me. I couldn't understand why there weren't more vineyards in the Thames Valley. To me, it just ticked so many boxes. But then we started looking, and then I realised, the biggest barrier to the Thames Valley is getting the land in the first place, because it is obviously, it's prime real estate. Farming. It's people do farm here, but it's more to keep hold of the land, to hold off until they get planning, essentially. That's what the farmers do. And one day, I guess it will happen and they'll make their millions. So we started searching, and we had a few sites, but they were going to have to be leased. And, in my head, this was a multi-generational, I was thinking long term, and the leasing option just didn't sit well with me. And we didn't have any kids at that point, but, we were hoping to start a family and something we wanted to pass on. And then I think it was probably February 2010. We just saw this plot come up on a website, and we were renting in Marlow, and we just hopped over the fence. It's just barely a mile out of Marlow. Stood in the field and sort of, bang, that was it. We knew this was the piece of land we've been waiting for, and by that March we'd snapped it up. And then we worked very, very quickly to get the land prepped and ready, and the vines went in that May. So it was a very quick turnaround, but I didn't want to lose any more time, so I'm impatient. And that's once those vines went in the ground, that was it, really. There's no turning back. And then we built the winery in 2013 in time for the first sort of proper commercial harvest. And we've been at it ever since.
So the vines have got a little bit of age on them then. They're not, they're still relatively young, but what's this, 9 years?
Yeah.
Right? 8 or 9 years?
Yeah, so they're sort of in their, 12th season now.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe 13th this year, I can't remember. But yeah, I'd say now, for me, they're sort of coming out of their adolescence.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at them, it's when they start getting interesting. That's, and we're starting to see it in the wines as well. The roots are getting down, the vigor is balancing out. and you're starting to get sort of site characteristics, soil characteristics, instead of sort of clonal characteristics, which we got in the early years, where the clones of each variety seemed to be the defining factor of how the vine performed and the flavors. Whereas now that's slowly waning, and the soil types are starting to come through, and we sort of treat the vineyard slightly differently now. So, but that's exciting. That's, for us, that's what it's all about. That is, we have one site where our job is to get the best out of it, to find those little nuances that are unique to where we are, and do our best to put them into the wine. It's no mean feat, but that's the way I see my job, essentially.
Well, that's the perfect way to lead into your sparkling wines. So where would you like to start?
We might kick off with the Brut, the Non Vintage, which is our most important wine. Yes, the vintage wines are more expensive, etc. But this is, for me, I view this is the one wine we have to produce every year without fail, no matter what Mother Nature decides to chuck at us, and we have to keep this wine at the same level year after year. It's the one I'd say we sell most of to the on-trade, to the restaurant trade. And obviously ourselves and our wholesalers work very hard to get these wines on wine lists, and we want to keep the quality where it is. And the idea is this wine never runs out, hence why it's non-vintage. It just moves from one vintage, one bottling to the next. But we have started to put a number on the back, because the sort of annoying thing for me about non-vintage was, well, there's no information about what's in it. A lot of non-vintage wines are, they say NV or multi-vintage, and that's about as far as it goes. Some don't even bother telling you what grape varieties are in it.
So Henry, this one says number 6. Is that the 6th iteration?
So this is our 6th release. Yeah, so this is our 6th release of this wine. And admittedly, not everyone cares as long as it tastes good, that is enough for a lot of people. But for those who want to differentiate between the different bottlings, and there will be variation, because we're a 6.5 hectare estate, and the vintage variation, I think in this one it's about 65-70% of that vintage 2017. So number 6 is based off 2017, and the rest comes from older years, 15 and 14, a touch of 2013 in there. But you can go on the website, and it will just say number 6 is what's in the bottle. So it gives the wine a bit of character and a bit of, okay, this is what it's all about. Instead of just saying it's another bottle of non-vintage wine, we want to try and give it a bit of identity. And a lot of people, I think, are sort of moving. Rhoda have just done that. They've just moved. They got rid of their Brut Premier, and they've started doing a similar thing. And I know a lot of other people are doing it. And yeah, just more interesting, I think. So this wine is based, as I said, on 2017. It only came out, must have been October, November last year. So it's, because last year, last year was a big year as far as sales after COVID. There's a lot of pent up demand. So, I'm sure for a lot of producers, last year was pretty manic, and all of a sudden we found ourselves with not much wine and having to disgorge as quickly as we possibly can. So this was only disgorged in November, early November. So it hasn't had much cork time, but actually tasting it now, so the first time I see, it's actually, the nose is actually starting to come out. It's still a pretty young wine as far as cork age is concerned. Ideally, we'd like to get it to, well, for me, in a perfect world, it's 6 months. So, people who buy direct from us, I always say, if you can hold on to these, 6 months cork age makes such a massive difference. So yeah, you can sort of pick up a bit of, the reserve wine elements. The toastiness is only just slightly starting to come in, but the toastiness only really kicks in after about the 6 month point, I find. And it's 40% Chardonnay, 40% Pinot, and 20% Pinot Meunier. And that is the exact sort of splits of vines we have in the vineyard. So,
really?
it's a direct representative of the whole site, essentially. So bits from the whole site. Obviously, it's multi-vintage. So really, it's sort of it's sort of showing the site as a whole. With the vintage wines, we pick the eyes out of. This is sort of a broad view of the site. And we tend to focus, most of our cuvées, we tend to focus on Pinot. And that is partly due to personal preference. Before we even started making wine, myself and Kaye, we did a lot of tasting, obviously, and we always just preferred the wines with a sort of higher Pinot content. And hence all our wines are led by Pinot, obviously apart from the Blanc De Blanc, which is the exception. But yeah, so we do focus on Pinot, and I have and thankfully I think it is a good site for Pinot. We put it on the Pinot goes on the sort of slightly more clayier, sort of a bit more clay before it hits the chalk, and that just helps to build sort of a bit of structure in that lovely Pinot length.
How do you imagine? How do you imagine people drinking this wine? Do you think this is a wine they should have with food? Is this a party style wine, something to sit back and enjoy? What's your envision?
I mean, I don't tend to personally get involved in too much, sort of telling people or showing people, I mean, for me personally, I drink a lot of sparkling wine. I never did it before until I started making sparkling wine, drinking sparkling wine with food. It always used to be an aperitif style of wine, and these days, not just my wine, but I'm just obsessed with grower champagnes, and I buy a lot of fizz for my own personal consumption, and I'm always drinking them with food these days. Hence why, actually, I think since the first years the dosage has come down. That's more of a personal preference, that actually if you are drinking this sort of stuff with food, you do need a bit of a dry edge to counter that, counter it with food. But it's a pretty versatile wine as far as I can see. It's quite soft. The reserve wines makes it quite soft, so it's quite approachable. It's good aperitif. Yeah, I can't really pigeonhole it into any sort of surrounding. But yeah,
very fresh. That's the first thing I picked up on. This is something our industry has, and I really like that characteristic within our wines, particularly the sparkling wines, because I love how it cuts through certain food groups and it gives the wine a real definition. So yeah, very crisp, fresh, lots of citrus on the nose. It was a nice, delicate coating of the tongue, which was good, because after smelling the aromas, I was expecting perhaps it might be a bit too sharp, but it wasn't. It was still quite gentle and soft, and I can see how, as you're saying, if you're going to experiment with a bit more aging, that could be quite interesting to see how much contact leaves and so forth. Going again.
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, that it is a trump card for English sparkling wines. Freshness is something the Champenois are desperately searching for in these really hot years, where it's something we sort of take it for granted in the UK. Freshness is always something we're blessed with, and in fact, what we tend to work more is building the richness and the complexity. That's what we do. Whereas in Champagne, it's probably the opposite way around. It's trying to retain that acidity and freshness. Whereas, for this wine, to me, it needs a bit more cork time. That's just the way it is. But it will round out, and it'll build that sort of layers of chewiness, that Pinot chewiness, all that sort of stuff. I think will come, as we get some bottle age.
So
but it's pretty, for something that's 2 months old.
Sorry, Henry. I've just noticed, looking at your label here on the top, on the neck, we've got here, it says hard work. And then if you spin it around, good fortune. Now we both, or rather everybody knows what both of those mottos means, but what's the relevance for you to put those on your bottle?
Well, it's partly to do with the name, because when we started, it was the sort of hardest bit of the whole process, as I remember, was coming up with the name.
Getting going is.
It is, found it very stressful, and I didn't want to just call it Marlow Vineyard. To me, it was, we wanted something that we could call our own. I wanted something that sort of sums up the site. The thing I loved about France is, when you bought a piece of vineyard, or every single vineyard in France, if you go on a place called the Cadastre, every vineyard has a name, of every parcel and every part of France, or every piece of land in France has a name. And those names often describe the site themselves, what it's like to farm, and I wanted something of similar ilk. And then, you know, in the early years when we were working the soil, the main characteristic of our soil is it has a massive amount of flint in it. Okay. You've got the chalk flint, but then you've also got lots and lots of gravel, which was laid down because we're only about a couple of miles from the Thames. So back in the day, that put down a lot of gravel into the clay. So it was really, really stony. It was really tough to work. So Harrow's in, you know, to cultivate, to work the soil in those early years, and to hope it didn't destroy anything, because we went through so many pieces of machinery. You know, we'd have 20 punches a year. My dog was down the vets pretty much every month with a cut paw. You know, it was really, sort of banging your head against the wall in those first few years. It has since got easier as we've worked the soil, we've built up the organic matter using cover crops. It's got easier. But in those early years, it was a bit of a struggle. But you know, that is the site. That's the characteristic of the site. Yeah. That's why the vines love it. You know, you want a tough soil for vines, so they have to work a bit harder to produce the fruit and the concentration. And then we sort of turned that Harrow and Hope to hard work and good fortune, and we felt that was a nice, you know, that pretty much for us sums up what we're doing here. Is just, you know, the harder you work, the more fortune you seem to get. So yeah, it just seemed a nice motto for what we do. It's very hands-on. You know, we're a small place. We have to do a lot of the work ourselves, but that's why we do it in the first place.
What you summed up there is, I mean, that's wine. Wine is people and stories, without trying to sound too cliche, but it is. And it's the journeys that you've had and what you've discovered and the challenges working with the soils, because it's not an easy thing to do, to plant a vineyard and then to have to wait, you know, 24 months really before things start to get going properly and so on and so forth, and then continual maintenance. So, but yes, it's nice to hear how you guys came up with the concept and the story.
Well, it's just trying to create something, you know, that was authentic, that sort of summed us up relatively well. And you know, things have moved. You know, we've experimented with all sorts of stuff, and we've now moved to organics. We're sort of in our second year conversion into organics, and that's sort of a big part of our viticultural journey now. And you know, we're starting to see the benefits. And you know, last year was a true test of our organic system, and thankfully we came through very well. But yeah, it's just every year is a different challenge, but you know, it's never boring. That's for sure. It's never boring.
That's not a word anyone, I think, would ever associate within wine, particularly when you're in the vineyard. Challenging and many other words, but not more boring. Frustrating, probably as well, a lot of the time.
Yeah, it can be. But you know, it's like, you know, I played a lot of sport in my time, and you just you play what's in front of you essentially, and that's part of the enjoyment, but it's part of the struggle. But it makes it, you know, when you can sit down, you have a glass of something, and you're really happy with it. You know, it means that bit extra if you've been through the whole thing.
I completely agree. Should we move on to the next wine?
Yeah, let's go for that. So I think we're going to Rosé. Just. So in the first sort of, our first harvest, you know, when you know you've got sort of 3 years, maybe 4 years before you're actually going to sell a bottle, you know, the question is always, you know, so what are you actually going to make? What do you think is going to do best on the site? And you know, I knew where the other sort of, you know, non-vintage, Blanc De Blanc, Blanc De Noir, but the Rosé bit, I was slightly, okay, so when do people drink sort of sparkling Rosé? Do they drink it in restaurants? Do they drink it in, you know, as an aperitif? And I got a whole world of different answers from producers I was sort of speaking to, because I never saw sparkling Rosé that much on restaurant lists. You know, it was always taken up by sort of non-vintage. There's a bit of Rosé. I mean, Rosé's taken off. This was sort of 10 years ago, and Rosé is such a massive phenomenon now. So in the early years, we didn't make much Rosé because I just didn't really know where it was going to go. But I have to say, it's probably one of our most popular blends. We tend to release it in April. It's mostly vintage. We have done a non-vintage in the past, and we're actually going to do a non-vintage this year. But we try, we know that our customers mostly drink this, it starts selling in April. People tend to just drink it throughout the summer, and by Christmas it's gone. That is the nature of this wine. So we try and make it, more fruit focused than the other wines. So it has a slightly shorter lees aging than the other wines. Again, we focus on Pinot. Obviously, you have the red wine element, which we've learned over the years is probably the key element to the rosé. So we use the assemblage method.
Okay.
So we make the red wine separately and blend back normally around 7% into the wine. For us, that's the best way to get that fruit character out of the wine. The Saignée method, for me, the ones I tried, they tend to be a bit more vegetal, a bit more savoury, which again works well in different scenarios. But if you wanted to focus on fruits, then for us, the assemblage method was the best method to use. Most of our clones of Pinot are champagne clones, but we do have one clone, 292, which is, well, I think it's a Burgundy, but I'm thinking more research I've done. I think it's actually from the Jura. So it's got a nice amount of colour, and that's the one we save for the red wine component. And yeah, it's 2018. So as I'm sure you know, was a pretty landmark year in the UK. Big yields, big ripeness. Arguably the perfect year. And to me, it does reflect in the 18s. They're very easygoing. They're beautifully balanced, and customers, there's good freshness, but they're not, they don't have that acidity poking out like you get in some years. And this one actually now it was disgorged. My bottle was disgorged in August. A bit of toastiness is just starting to come through. Sadly, this wine always sells out before that toastiness, and actually I quite like to drink it at this point when you're starting to get a bit of those sort of that development, a bit of yeasty character that comes through. Not too much, but enough to make it a bit more complex.
What I thought was quite interesting was I got, particularly considering how young it is and what you said, I was actually getting some rhubarb, which I was really surprised. That was really lovely. The slight tartiness, a little bit of the, the natural sweetness that you get. But it reminded me of a rhubarb crumble, which was lovely, to be frank.
Yeah. So yeah, it's been, we made a lot of this wine, and I thought it was going to last a lot longer than it did. But it was, it seems to have gone down very well. But I like to try it 6 months and beyond cork time, because you do get a bit more, it's nice to have the fruit, but for me, I always like a bit more extra in the wine as well.
I think it's very important that we touched on it. The English sparkling wines, they do need time to settle, because we don't want it too acidic. We don't want it too punchy, because it can be very challenging for the palate. So I agree with you. I think it's nice to allow, you don't age it for forever, but it's finding that balance for your vineyard and for your winemaking technique that you want to achieve.
Yeah.
I'm all for that.
Yeah, no, and this year we'd normally release the next vintage 2019 in April, but it's a great wine, but I think we're going to push it another year, so the next vintage release is not going to be until April 2023, because in the meantime we do have a non-vintage rosé that's going to come out in April.
Okay.
So going to buy our vintage rosé a bit more time on in the bottle, and disgorge it, so we make sure when it releases it's got 6 months on cork, which I think will really help, build the sort of complexity in the wine. As you say, we just need to be a bit more patient with someone. Just because you sell out something very, very quickly, there's always the temptation to go to the next one. Whereas sometimes you've got to stop and say, yes, we could release this, but actually another year will make a world of difference. So hold your horses and, do it at the right time. So that's what we're doing with the 2019. But yeah, the non-vintage will be pretty exciting as well.
Sure. Let's try the next one.
Okay. So next up is the Blanc De Blanc. We just put all this way. This when we when we started, we didn't actually have an intention of doing a Blanc De Blanc in the first year, which is quite bizarre, with it being such a popular style. You know, and I've since changed my views. But we had in the first harvest, which was 2013, we had a clone of Chardonnay that really struggled to get settled. The roots took a while. It was on pretty much pure chalk, and it just took a bit of time to get going. In that first harvest, there was hardly any fruit. You know, a bunch, maybe 2 bunches per vine. So we thought, well, you know, as a small experiment, let's pick it separately and let's do a small cuvee of Blanc De Blanc, pure Chardonnay, and we absolutely loved it. We didn't make very much of it in the early years, but we've since sort of built up the volume, and so we tend to now just make it in the years where, you know, Chardonnay works well, and arguably Chardonnay works better most years compared to Pinot. You know, I think the old champagne saying is every year is a Chardonnay year, whereas Pinot is a bit fickle, and, you know, some years you think you've got it and some years it's just not, the fragrance isn't there. But 2017 is a good example of a year for us where, you know, the Pinot was good, was fine, but the Chardonnay for us stood out. It was really definitely the year for Chardonnay in 2017, and so we decided to do a bit more volume in 2017. We always ferment it about 50% in oak. Oak has always been a big part of our style from day one. We were very lucky to get sort of biannual visits from Dr. Tony Jordan, sort of ex Domaine Chandon in the Yarra Valley. Worked for Mert and Chandon for many years, and, you know, he was quite adamant of using oak for holding reserve wines, also as fermentation. So this one has the most fermentation in oak, so about 50%, and, you know, mostly in barriques, but we've since sort of moved to larger format oak, and it just helps to build a bit of richness into the wine. They're quite old barrels when we get them, about 7 years old by the time we get them, so the oak flavour is sort of long since disappeared, but it does give it some lovely richness and complexity.
So why did you switch from barriques to larger oak barrels?
Mainly because better freshness and longevity. Okay. In the barriques, I found that you got a lot of character quite early. I mean, it's a question of oxygen at the end of the day. You know, a barrique is sort of the optimal size, sort of oxygen to wine ratio. As the bigger format you go, that ratio drops, so you get less oxygen into the wine. You get sort of slower uptake of oak character in new barrels. And also for holding reserve wines, we found you can keep the reserve wines for, you know, 3, sometimes 4 years, but then you really need to start using those reserve wines in your sort of non-vintage blends, and not keep them barrel too long. Whereas the larger format, we can keep them fresher for longer. So, but it's a sort of slow migration from the smaller format to the larger format, because we have to buy them new, and they're incredibly expensive. So we're sort of, and you can't, if you buy them all new, you've obviously got too much oak character to disperse. So we just buy a couple a year and just slowly build them up. So it's a sort of slow process. But in sort of the Blanc De Blanc in 2017, you get a lot of character quite early on. And it was only scored again in August last year, so it's not quite had 6 months, but it is now starting to, you know, to open up, to get a bit of sort of that creamy toastiness is just starting to come through now on the nose. We sell a lot of this sort of pre-release and just before Christmas, and most of the time I tell people, don't touch it, you know, leave it for another 6 months, otherwise you're not gonna make the most of it. But now I think it's starting to get a nice bit of development, and it'll go on for a while.
I'm sure, I know, I can see it because it's still got that zip of acidity. Still, then I can see how, so if that calms down just a little, you'll get so much more development within the wine and so much out of it, and with a bit of aging, it will be wonderful. Again, another great food pairing wine. I think I'd really like to have this with something a bit fattier, so maybe like fish and chips, or just to cut through the chunky potatoes and the batter. I think it would be wonderful. A really good interplay of flavors. It's very, very fresh. Again, I think a summer wine, for some reason, that's what it's making me feel like. I want to be outside and just experiencing it. And
I just generally want to be outside in summer, generally,
yeah. I'm trying to bring it on for us.
But yeah, no, I agree with all that. And I think, and to be honest, by the time summer comes around, I think it's going to be singing. It's going to have a bit more time on cork, and I think that's, as I keep saying, I think that is the key.
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah. So, 3 great wines. Thank you for sending them through and for running through them. What's coming next for Harrow and Hope? Because you touched a little bit on it earlier on about some of the plans and how you got to where you are, but what about launching forward? What's coming?
Well, we've sort of, our site, we've essentially maxed out our site, 6.5 hectares. I feel we're at the point now where, the big thing the last 2 years has been the movement to organic, studying that, making sure that works, observing the effects on the vines and the wines. So I think we're at the point now where I'm very comfortable with how we do things and how we combat the weather, the frost, all these things. We've got a good team here who, are, very reliable, and they work very hard. So I think we're nicely set up with what we got. But I am quite keen now to expand a little bit. I mean, I never want us to be huge, because the bigger we get, the less hands-on I become, and actually that is a big part of the job that I enjoy. So we're gonna, there's a few things in the pipe work about maybe planting some more vines, but being organic, it's such an intense season. You've got to be so on it. We need to find something that really is going to work. And as I said at the beginning, it's quite hard around here to find land to plant, but we're getting closer, and so hopefully that's going to be the sort of next step, getting some new land and exploring it, because that's the best bit about this job, is you have a plot of land and you work it and you observe, you see the changes, you see the effects on the wines, and that's the most enjoyable bit. So to get another piece and go through that again, I think would be pretty exciting.
And that rounds up. So as you said, that rounds up beautifully with what you were saying right at the start of our conversation, of how when you were outside in France and just enjoying being in the land and taking it all in, and also on the other side of the world. So I'm not surprised it all comes together for you, and that's the place for you to be. Henry, thank you for these 3 lovely wines. I can't wait to see where the project goes and what's coming next. And I look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.